Warm greetings to you all, and thank you for joining MCC's webinar. Peace on both sides of the border, North and South Korea. Really glad you've chosen to join us, and hopefully some of you had a chance to take the quiz about your favorite Korean food. I haven't seen those results yet. I'm personally a big fan of Korean barbecue, but there might be some kimchi and bibimbap fans out there as well. So this is a near monthly occurrence where we have a behind the scenes look at MCC's work around the world. And we've got lots of people joining us on Zoom tonight, many also on Facebook Live from a number of countries. So warm greetings to all of you. And thank you. Thank you for your support of MCC, for your interest in our work. We're thrilled that you're part of the MCC story and thrilled that we get to offer you this inside glimpse of how we serve together in the name of Christ. My name is Rick Cober Bauman. I serve as the Executive Director of Mennonite Central Committee, Canada, and I will be your host today. I'm coming to you from my home, which is just outside the tiny hamlet of Shakespeare, Ontario, Canada. So a few basic instructions. I'm going to do this quickly because you're probably pros at this, but we are looking for your questions. And so we invite you to submit those if you're on Zoom, to do that through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you've joined us via Facebook Live, you can submit through the Facebook comments section. And we've got somebody monitoring that, and we'll try our best to answer as many, maybe all of the questions. If we can't, we'll try and get back to you later on with some offline responses. Do keep your microphone muted. That way everybody has the best audio experience. And questions can come in anytime. We will take them in the last part of the webinar. We'll hear our guests in the first half hour or so. And then you will be prompted, I'm sure, by things you hear, answers to other questions. And also, we are recording. So if you have to step away or you are just thrilled to have heard this and you want all your friends to see it, let them know about it, because they'll be able to log on and appreciate this as well if they couldn't come in live tonight. I can't say tonight because it's only tonight for me. You people that are joining us today are scattered across the globe. I will try not to make that time zone error again. So our title again, Peace on Both Sides of the Border, North and South Korea. A little note, we had this conversation earlier. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is the formal name of the DPRK, North Korea. But most of us don't use that term, and you won't hear that very often. Tonight, our presenters will go with the more commonly used, more popularly used North Korea. For a number of decades, MCC has worked in North and South Korea. Our work has always been situated within the broader context of MCC's commitment to peace, grounded in a recognition that all people are created in God's image and have dignity. So today we're going to discuss how MCC is changing the narratives of hostility and isolation between North and South Korea to one of peace and reconciliation, addressing a history of war, division, and hostility. Now, I'm extra excited about tonight's webinar because I had the chance of traveling to North Korea a few years ago, fall of 2018, and got a chance to glimpse close up, albeit for a few short days, of what people live like in DPRK. What are some of the challenges, the daily challenges of life in North Korea? So I think it was helpful for me, and hopefully tonight will be helpful for you, to see a broader, richer understanding, for us not to have a single story of North Korea. So our introduction of speakers, I want to first of all introduce Rebecca Burkholder and Blain Derstine. Together, they are the area directors of MCC for Central, Southern, and Northeast Asia. I was looking at your screen, Blain and Rebecca, when I was reminded that I can't say tonight because it's early morning for you in Thailand, Chiang Mai, where they are based. Rebecca grew up in Goshen, Indiana, attended Goshen College, and then pursued a law degree at Georgetown University Law Center. Blain grew up in Pennsylvania, Harleysville to be precise, and holds a master's degree in international economics from Catholic University. And before moving to Thailand in 2016, they lived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So warm welcome to Blain and Rebecca. And co-presenting with them, Chris Rice. Chris is director of the MCC United Nations office in New York City. Prior to that, Chris and his wife Donna served as MCC representatives for Northeast Asia based in South Korea. Chris is the author of 3 books, including Reconciling All Things, A Christian Vision for Justice, Peace, and Healing. Chris, warm welcome to you. And I would now like to turn it over to our presenters for the next part of our webinar, please.
Thank you, Rick. We're glad to be with you. There may be no greater social divide in our time than that between the people of North and South Korea. Korea was a united land for over 1,000 years before the Korean War began in 1950. The Korean Peninsula, which you can see on this map right between China and Japan, had a unique culture and language for centuries. But since the Korean War, for 70 years, ordinary North and South Koreans have lived completely isolated from each other. Families are separated. The Korean War in 1950 split the country in 2. South Korea is a democracy with a developed economy, and North Korea is a highly centralized one-party state. This deep division and unresolved war between North and South Korea, it never actually officially ended, is one of the most tragic in history. And in recent years, tensions and hostilities have increased within and between the Koreas and between the Koreas in North America, especially the United States. Many in the West consider North Korea to be our greatest enemy. This hostility has translated into fear-based narratives that can dehumanize North Koreans. MCC has long advocated for greater opportunities for engagement with people in North Korea, believing that peace comes not through isolation and aggression, but through personal connections. In this photo you see here, Chris Rice is shaking the hand of a medical director of a pediatric hospital that MCC supports in North Korea. MCC has been providing humanitarian assistance to the people of North Korea for more than 25 years. By approaching others with the outstretched hand of peace, by providing hospitality to those we consider to be the enemy, we can work across divides and see that reconciliation is actually possible. So today in this webinar, we'll look at the ways MCC is creating a new reality and changing the narrative from hostility and isolation to that of reconciliation. MCC is doing this by serving North Korean farmers, children, and others. We're supporting Christians in South Korea to pursue reconciliation, the importance of exchanges between North Koreans and North Americans. And we'll talk about advocacy with US and Canadian governments for reconciliation.
First, we will take a short look back at MCC in the Korea Peninsula. MCC was deeply involved in South Korea during and after the Korean War. Beginning in 1950, MCC had personnel working with displaced persons, relief, and material aid shipments. MCC also operated a vocational school which provided vocational training to hundreds of war orphans. Between 1950 and 1971, MCC sent over 80 volunteers to work in South Korea. In 1971, after 20 years, MCC concluded its program in South Korea as local communities and the government were then able to operate the programs that had been established. 30 years later, 2001, the Korean Anabaptist Center was started in South Korea. As an MCC partner, the center provided global exchange opportunities for young adults. Then, in 2014, The MCC Northeast Asia office was moved from Beijing, China to Chuncheon, South Korea. After more than 40 years, MCC had officially returned to South Korea. Since 1995, when North Korea experienced a severe famine, MCC has responded to needs and hunger in the midst of a sensitive political climate. In this slide from 1999, MCC staff visit farming communities in North Korea where MCC helped to increase crop productions. Through the years, MCC staff have regularly visited North Korea to monitor projects, establishing relationships and connections. Except for short periods of time, 3 to maybe 6 months, MCC personnel have not been stationed or live in North Korea. MCC's work in North Korea is coordinated from our office in South Korea. We now turn to Chris to hear more about how MCC has served the vulnerable in North Korea for over 25 years.
It's a great joy to be with all of you in this webinar tonight. This matter is very close to my heart. I grew up in South Korea, where my parents served as missionaries for 12 years. And it was a privilege to go back and live in South Korea for 5 years with my wife, Donna, to serve as MCC co-rep in Northeast Asia. And from growing up there until now, there's really been 3 constant realities about North and South Korean people. One is the sense of a threat to one another. 2, paradoxically, is a yearning for reunion. And 3, no contact. I call it the 99.9% rule. 99.9% of North Koreans, no contact with South Koreans, vice versa. 99.9% of North Koreans, no contact with Americans, Canadians, vice versa. So the danger is what Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie called the danger of a single story, seeing the other as a monolithic caricature, as threatening. Yet we know in any place of deep conflict, often political peace, yes, is needed, but so is people-to-people engagement, change through contact. And this is really why MCC's engagement with North Korea is so rare and significant, creating the possibility for positive change through contact both directions. And over the past 25 years, MCC has been one of just a few American or Canadian agencies that have worked inside of North Korea. Over this time, we've had many different forms of engagement, from equipment to produce soy milk for children, to English teachers living in Pyongyang for a few months, to conservation agriculture on 6 farms, Canadian Food Banks project, to support for Christian Friends of Korea, a US agency, and its really remarkable anti-tuberculosis work in the country. But there's been 2 priorities all along for MCC. Number 1, support for vulnerable people in spite of political difference, in spite of politics. Number 2, face-to-face, people-to-people engagement, seeking to humanize one another, to gain empathy for one another. So what's the current shape of MCC work, the latest iteration? Let me describe that. In 2016, at the initiation of our North Korean counterparts, we began support for 3 pediatric hospitals. You see them here on the map, those 3 different cities. These are provincial hospitals. So this would be like the Manitoba Pediatric Hospital or the Pennsylvania Pediatric Hospital. Children with more complicated cases are referred to them. There's about 250 children at each. And each year, through 2 shipments, MCC provides canned meat. The next slide, here are children who are eating MCC canned meat at one of the hospitals in soup. They really stretch it a long way. MCC canned meat is highly nutritious. We also send health kits. We send multivitamins to help kids recover from surgeries, sickness. We send water filters. Why water filters? So imagine running a hospital without a source of clean, accessible water. That's the situation at 2 of these hospitals. Their hand-dug wells are shallow. During dry season, actually, the hospital staff, maybe including these ladies, haul water from far away. They're not able to cook, drink clean water. Many of the patients are sick as a result, have diarrhea. MCC water filters are quite amazing. They provide clean water instantly through the filter, and patients can take them home. Hospitals have documented 70% reduction in diarrhea among those children. And one family even told the story of taking their water filter back and sharing it with their fellow villagers. MCC, we also develop plans to support these hospitals to dig deep wells for permanent clean water. Great plan, unfortunately delayed due to sanctions, which we'll talk about later, and then now the pandemic. We also make 2 monitoring visits each year to ensure that our support, is benefiting the intended hospitals and patients. These visits are extremely important for change through contact. Let me describe a little bit about those visits. Our government counterparts drive us to the hospital. We are always warmly greeted. First, we go to the office of the hospital's director, and they show us documentation of the use of our canned meat and other resources. We ask questions about that until we're satisfied. Now, in North Korea, MCC canned meat, as I mentioned, is highly valued. And every visit we ask, do you know where the canned meat comes from? And there's always several people in the room who don't know. And so we tell the story. The meat is not from a factory, and they're surprised to hear that. It's not from the US government. It's not from the Canadian government. It is from ordinary American and Canadian people who organize meat canning in their communities. And quite remarkably, we tell them about MCC's absolutely unique mobile meat canning truck. I don't know if it's the only one in the world, but believe me, when they hear this story, they're surprised and they're moved to hear it. And we always say, this meat is canned with great love. It's sent to the children here who we know that you love with great love. We then leave the director's office. We go look at whatever remaining boxes of meat are in storage. We count them. Then we go to the kitchen. The slide before showed the cooks. It's always delightful to visit them, always a highlight. We talk to them. They tell us about how they use the meat. We go to the dining room. We engage the children. And here you see, we visit the exam rooms. It's always very moving to go into the exam rooms to see the children. And often the mothers are with their children during their stay. Often a doctor or a nurse is on the MCC team. They meet with doctors and nurses on the staff. So through the years of MCC support and our visits, a different face has been presented for them of American, Canadian, Christian, a face which interrupts narratives of hostility. And we see and bring back home a different face from the single story of North Koreans, I'm sorry. Both directions, we have become more human to one another. Blain and Rebecca?
While MCC is working in North Korea, we are also working on the other side of the border, the southern side, to support the church in South Korea on a path toward peace and reconciliation. In this photo, you're seeing the border between North and South Korea, with the church on the edge of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Christians make up about 30% of the population in South Korea. They are often suspects of talk of peace and reconciliation, and positive engagements toward North Korea are denounced as pro-communist by some churches. For many Christians, forgiveness and reconciliation with the communists in North Korea are unthinkable options. For Korean Christians, Anabaptism represents a different approach, that we are to love our enemy, whether that enemy is in North Korea or in our home community. Because a peace treaty was never signed between the US and North Korea to officially end the Korean War, there is a lot of mistrust between the countries. The US currently maintains around 80 military bases in South Korea. These military bases represent the longest permanent US military presence in the world since World War II.
Our MCC Northeast Asia rep, Song-Han Kim, pictured here with Blain, is part of the Anabaptist Peace Witness in the midst of this militarization. Song-Han is a child of war refugees, the grandson of internally displaced people. Both of Song-Han's parents were born in North Korea. His grandparents were uprooted by the separation of North and South Korea. They moved to the South and soon became war refugees. During the Chuseok holiday, which is Korean Thanksgiving, which was actually celebrated yesterday, September 21st in South Korea, family members traditionally return to their home village to gather, share food, and give thanks to their ancestors. But Song-Han's parents could not return to their home village in North Korea for the Chuseok holiday. Instead, Song-Han remembers that his father would pack the family up in the car and drive as close to the dividing line between North and South Korea that was possible for civilians. This is called the 38th parallel, and you see it here in this photo. His father would set up a large telescope, and each family member would take turns looking into the telescope, across the fields, through the fence, and over the river to North Korea. Sometimes they could even see people. This was the family tradition for them on Chuseok, since they did not have a home village to return to. Now, during the Chuseok holiday, Song-Han's family visits his father's grave, which you see here. This is the closest graveyard to North Korea. The people buried here are those who, because of the division between North and South and the violence of the Korean War, were forced to flee from the North to the South. Song-Han, a graduate of the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and working on his PhD from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, has been a mentor and supporter of South Koreans looking for a different way, a way of peace. Song-Han has supported conscientious objectors, or COs, in South Korea. South Korea has strictly enforced mandatory military service for all men between the ages of 18 and 35, and until recently had no alternative service for conscientious objectors. The history of compulsory military service has profoundly shaped Korean Christianity, introducing nationalism and militarism into churches in South Korea. Cho Sun-young, pictured here, on the right, declared he was taking the path of a CO for reserve duty in 2014. Song Han, our MCC rep, attended the same Mennonite church as Sun Yun. Last month, Song Han testified at this young man's trial, which is trial number 15 over 7 years. As witness at this trial, Song Han made the link between Sun Yun's Mennonite faith and his motivation to be a CO. Our MCC rep helped familiarize the judges and prosecutors of the Mennonite traditional peace church stance. Song Han's witness for Sun Yun is one example of MCC's support of Christians pursuing peace and reconciliation in South Korea through speaking engagements, forums, outreach to the next generation of Christians, a Korean peace journal called Plan P, and ongoing public engagement. MCC is planting seeds of change in Korean society. 20 years ago, Mennonites in South Korea were often viewed as a kind of cult. This has changed dramatically. While Mennonites are still a minority, they're often sought out for teaching and writing. Their life of simplicity and shared community and peacemaking stands in contrast to the South Korean church. Amidst divisions, they represent a different way of thinking about peace, about North Korea, about thinking about our enemy. Chris?
So another key engagement moving to the north side of the divide is bringing North Koreans outside the country for exchange. And this is very significant for seeking change through contact. In 2018, what's pictured here is we began at the initiation of our counterparts an exchange with the Academy of Agriculture Science, AAS. This is North Korea's leading ag science research center. 5 North Korean ag scientists spent 10 days in Manitoba, Canada, with leading Canadian scientists. This is Dr. Martin Entz, who teaches at the University of Manitoba. And the focus was soil conservation, soil fertility, low input agriculture. It had quite an impact. One North Korean ag scientist during that time experimented with keeping fields moist using rice straw instead of plastic. And they went back, they implemented it in their country. It was very successful. And we repeated this ag exchange in 2019. In 2016, the next slide, North Korea sent 5 diplomats to Manitoba for 4 days with MCC, and including our counterparts who we work with there. And we met together with the 5 diplomats at the MCC office, talked about challenges in our work, had transparent give and take about addressing challenges in our work. I have to admit, though, we also did a lot of eating together. And, eating together across differences is really a key part of change through contact. There's a proverb, it's not from Korea, it's from Rwanda. And it says, if you cannot hear the mouth eating, you cannot hear the mouth crying. And here they are, hosted for dinner in the home of a Manitoba farmer's family. And we talked a lot that night about rhubarb. There was a lot of rhubarb served. They had never heard of rhubarb. But we also talked a lot about kimchi, which is very central to the Korean diet, north and south. Now, in the next slide, you'll see the delegation with MCC leaders and hosts. And so there's 5 of them there that are pictured at the Winnipeg office. And over the 4 days together, we visited an MCC thrift store. They bought items, went to an MCC warehouse. They saw how MCC canned meat is sent to their country and met people who do that. We also took them to the Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach, and they heard the famous Mennonite story of Dirk Willem saving his pursuer from the ice. Now, before they came, we asked them if they wanted to have any Korean food. And they said no. So that's fine. So we didn't plan it. But it was pretty funny because after 2 days, they admitted they were desperate for kimchi and rice. So we called and found a Korean restaurant, and we really didn't know much about it. When we arrived, we found out that the restaurant was owned by immigrants from South Korea, and the owners did not know who was coming for lunch. And honestly, I was a little bit nervous what would happen. But as soon as the owners learned that these were North Koreans, they warmly welcomed them. They explained the menu, and there was a flurry of ordering, all in Korean. Let me say this. It is quite possible that was the only place in the world that day where North Korean diplomats were together with people of South Korean heritage. Now, I want you to notice the Korean gentleman at the front on the left. He is a high-ranking North Korean diplomat. In the next slide, this is a picture of that same diplomat. He's on the right side of the table, and he's in New York City. Across the table from him is US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Let us hope that the seeds planted for change by MCC with our North Korean counterparts are seeds that will take root across tables like this. I have a younger South Korean friend who I'll talk about later, because now it's time for Blaine and Rebecca. Back to you.
Thanks, Chris. Just lastly, we'll focus for a few minutes on sanctions. Sanctions from the US, United Nations, and Canada are meant to pressure North Korea towards disarmament of nuclear weapons, but to date, isolating the North Korea from the global community has not been successful. In fact, tensions have escalated. Sanctions have limited humanitarian assistance. They prohibit all trade and financial transactions, but exemptions have allowed aid to continue on a more limited basis, but with more administrative requirements for organizations such as MCC. So this slide, this next slide, shows the UN sanctions that we have to apply to because there is a ban on metal objects that are sent to North Korea. So we need to apply for an exemption for safety pins that are part of the infant care kits you see up there in the left-hand corner. We have to apply for exemption for nail clippers that are part of the hygiene kits we provide for pediatric patients and their families. And we also need to apply for an exemption for the metal bucket handles you see on the right there that are part of the plastic buckets for water filters that provide clean water. So MCC works to apply to the UN for all these exemptions so these items can reach those who are in need. So our current reality is that North Korea's borders have been closed due to COVID-19 since January 2020. We've been not able to send in any shipments or delegations into North Korea, nor have North Koreans been able to come out and participate in exchanges that Chris was just talking about. We don't know when the borders will open again, but when they do, we'll call on the US to ease the restrictions on material aid and movement. MCC is really uniquely positioned as an organization that provides humanitarian aid while also advocating for engagement at the governmental level. And one of those ways is to actually have a dialogue on formally ending the Korean War. The path towards peace in the Korean Peninsula is complex, but it cannot be changed without these personal connections. We encourage policies of diplomacy, dialogue, and humanitarian assistance as we work towards lasting peace.
As we close our presenting, I want to tell you about a younger Korean friend of mine in South Korea. Her name is Song-hye. And Song-hye grew up not feeling the trauma of the Korean divide, like many of a younger generation. They didn't grow up with the war. They don't have a memory of that. So she really had no passion for a different future. But she decided to join a university Christian group that led a trip of students to the China-North Korea border. And on a boat ride to view the North, Song-hye saw two North Koreans up close, two soldiers sitting on a beach. And she said, one of them looked exactly like my brother. And only then did I understand that we are one people. It changed her. When she returned to South Korea, she met a South Korean who gave a talk about peacemaking. The speaker was a Korean Mennonite named Jaeyoung Lee. Jaeyoung's father worked at the Mennonite MCC vocational school in the 1960s. And influenced by his talk, Song-hye applied for the MCC Global Service Learning Program. She spent a year in the US. She returned to South Korea. And she's part of a new generation of young South Korean peacemakers. And in this generation, let us hope that they may one day be the ones to cross the border into North Korea and lead MCC's work there. As we said at the beginning of this webinar, peace comes not through isolation or aggression, but through personal connections, relationships that contribute to mutual understanding. Two countries, one mission. That's MCC's work. And amid political uncertainty, resistance to a new future from all sides, seeds of reconciliation are being planted on both sides of that divide. Thank you so much for joining in this webinar.
Wow, Chris and Blaine and Rebecca, thank you. I was just jotting little notes to myself from everything from Chris, your comment about this yearning for contact, meat canning, the 38th parallel story. By the way, as I'm sort of hitting some highlights here, reminder to those of you listening in, please send us your questions. We're eager to have some conversation with you over these next 20 minutes or so. I was struck by the conscientious objector trials stories as well. I think you said up to 15 of those now. And then, of course, this one I'd heard before, but again, I'm struck by the irony that safety pins require an exemption from sanctions. But I think through it all, there was this sense that change happens through contact, not through isolation, and this deep commitment to remain in relationship. So excellent, wonderful stories, and really, really prompting, I'm guessing, lots of reactions from people. You know, someone asked me about a neck warmer story. So I'm going to share this. I think, Chris, you've heard this story, but I was struck when you talked about the three things that are common across both Koreas, and one of them being this yearning for contact. Chris, you helped prepare our group before we went into North Korea in 2018. And one of the things you provided was some gifts, some handmade neck warmers from the Korean Anabaptist churches, South Korea. And I remember being a bit nervous as we gave these to hospital directors and others that hosted us, and where we wanted to share a gift of friendship. And I would say these were made by Christian churches. And gradually, as I went along, I sensed too this yearning for contact with the South. And so I was brave enough by about the third hospital to say these were made by people in South Korean Christian churches. And the response was remarkable. I would love to have one of these, I think was the response. And, this would be a wonderful thing for us to wear during the Korean winter. So that both yearning for contact and then celebration at this little indication of contact, a gift that we were able to share, was a really memorable experience for me that shifted that single story of how we tend to see North Korea. I'm not sure who wants to answer this. I'll throw it to any of you, but there's a question to understand a little bit more about the role of the South Korean church, I think particularly the Anabaptist community, in this ongoing reestablishment of contact, reconciliation efforts. Can you tell a few more stories about that?
Go ahead, Chris.
Chris is going to start us. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think, you have to understand that the South Korean churches are very divided about this. And so that's a lot of what the work is of our Korean Mennonite friends, is trying to get at biblical understandings. Because you could really say there's 4 different kinds of churches. There's churches that view North Korea as enemy nation. There's churches that view North Koreans as like a disadvantaged sibling, and simply we need to aid them, and we don't have anything to receive from them. There's those who view younger generation of Christians that I mentioned, who see North Korea as another country. It's not my problem. And there's those who view it as like a ruptured family members. And sometimes they feel these things all at once. So really central to the work of with South Korean churches is trying to address these different imaginations and approaches, and trying to bring a biblical understanding. I really think that's where the witness of South Korean Mennonites has really, as Blain and Rebecca mentioned, has really greatly increased over the last 10 years through books and speaking, even though there's still a very small minority in the country.
Well, Chris, you've stepped right over into another question that's come in. Someone's asking to understand a bit more about what is our biblical understanding of peace and reconciliation that helps shape the work in the Koreas. You've hinted at it, but someone's asked us to go a little deeper.
Well, maybe Blain and Rebecca could address that.
Looks like they're going to.
Oh, yeah. No, Chris, we'll punt that back to you.
Okay. Well, I know that Rebecca's father was a very famous theologian. So anyway, hopefully some of him rubbed off on me. I think it's grounded, it's grounded in, what is reconciliation about, but except between enemies. And, the three most unpopular words that Jesus said were, love your enemy. I think there's days when each of us who seeks to follow Christ wishes that he hadn't said those words, wishes that reconciliation was, having lunch together, and let bygones be bygones. But we really see within Scripture is the call to lament, to not be afraid to look at the truth of the brokenness, and the call to be prophetic about justice, about what's broken, and to go and, like in the Good Samaritan story of Jesus, to go to the one who's threatening to us, to the person by the side of the road, the stranger, the outcast. And so I think that these are the kinds of understandings that really shape MCC's approach to the Korean Peninsula, and these are the kinds of teachings that are actually being seen as a source of renewal within the South Korean church, which grew very fast. I was there over those years; it grew very fast, but now Christianity, in some ways, is declining in South Korea, and young people are not joining the church. So people are looking for a more costly, actually, kind of discipleship,
Mm.
which calls for sacrifice, but also invites us into the deep change that God is doing in the world.
Yeah, and I think we would just add that we often begin our presentations when we talk about North Korea with the verse, love your neighbor as yourself. And we often begin with that and end with that and frame what we're talking about in North Korea, South Korea, and all over Asia, really about loving your neighbor as yourself. It's really rooted in that. Thanks, Chris.
So I'm going to share back to you, not a question, but a comment that's come through to me. Praise the Lord for MCC and this moving presentation. Blessings on MCC program as it continues in the Korea. So I think Chris and Blain and Rebecca, you should hear that. You don't need to respond, but I think it's part of what we're hearing from our participants tonight. Thank you for sending that in. What about voices that we have to call for a different response to North Korea? One of the questions, yeah, here it is. How can people in the US and Canada push governments to change official stances towards North Korea?
Yeah, I can start with saying for people in the US, particularly thinking about how we can be a voice about officially, at least officially ending the war with Korea, officially ending the Korean War. And I know our Washington office has a specific action alert about this that I think can be added to the chat so that people in the United States can reach out to their representatives about officially ending this war after all these years. And I also know for those in Canada, we really have a great resource that's also on our MCC website. It's our Peace Packet Sunday, I believe it's called. And in that peace packet, there's resources from around the world, but including South Korea. And there's information in there about what some of the churches are doing in South Korea, some of the biblical framework about how we talk about this. So I'd also encourage people to look at those resources as well. So it's really continuing to understand the situation, continuing to know how to talk about this and to be aware of, being the danger of that single story and to be aware of the narratives and how we talk about people that are considered to be our enemy, but that we are called to really love them.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I know Laura has said that she's going to post some more resources for folks that are tuned in here tonight, beyond the ones that you've just mentioned. Thank you for that. Another piece of what I've sensed here tonight is that individual relationships are very important, but Chris, I was struck by the meat canning story, and I've been in situations too where when people learn that this is kind of a people to people, community to community, these folks who canned that meat or made those neck warmers, they don't know us, and yet there's an expression of love. I have a memory of one of the hospitals that we were where we were speaking to the administrator, and we were trying to understand better, how exactly is the meat used? Like, is it kind of directed and focused at particular nutritional needs? And so we asked the question something like, how do you decide which of the children get canned meat? And we saw this kind of twinkle in the administrator's eye, and he said, well, they all get it. After all, you just said, you're here to share God's love for all. So he put our own biblical understanding of God's love is for everybody back to us when we were asking a little more of a surgical question about the application of canned meat. I'd love to hear a bit more about this. What difference does it make that behind MCC there are people? We are not only those who are there, yourselves included, and other staff, but the many people like are on this call perhaps who've worked in thrift shops and helped to can meat. What difference does it make that there is a cloud of witnesses behind MCC's work? You're not frozen, you're just pausing, right? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll say something about that. I mean, I think that's one of the, I've served with a lot of different institutions and ministries. And one of the uniquenesses of MCC is how hands-on MCC supporters are, from we also bring, one thing we didn't mention, we also bring to North Korea, send to North Korea, quilts that are made by MCC volunteers. So, we tell those stories. And when those North Korean diplomats came and they're going back with these images in their mind of the kind of people who are volunteering in thrift stores, the people who are volunteering in the warehouse, who are packing the canned meat. I mean, not everyone is paid to do this. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And I think that is extremely meaningful, that we're representing a community when we're there. And I'll tell you, and I think we've all four of us have been to North Korea. When you're there, time is different. Time is somehow pregnant with meaning. And I think part of that is that we are the only Canadians, Americans, Christians that many of these people that we see will ever meet. And so everything that we say, what we do, and them knowing that people are standing behind us, that there's community behind us, that is a very meaningful message that's being sent, often without words.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. There are some other resources coming up in your chat if you want to go deeper with any of the areas we've touched on. We have a few more minutes and would also happily have more questions from those of you who are listening in, either things you haven't heard at all or someplace where you would like one of our presenters to go a little bit deeper. I see the references there now for the peace packet that Rebecca talked about earlier. There's some advocacy resources, history of MCC's work, and Laura, thanks for including the prayer for peace in North Korea. Blain, Rebecca, and Chris, as you reflect on the quite remarkable opportunities you've had to engage on the peninsula, north and south, what sort of comes to the top as you speak to our audience here tonight? These are folks, I think, who are fairly connected to MCC, probably fairly familiar with our work, but maybe less so with North and South Korea. What would be that nugget that you would want to send them with? If you remember one thing or hope for one thing, what would you want to send with us? And I'm going to go to Blain and Rebecca first this time.
I think one of the things that I have always been moved by when being with South Koreans and being a chance to go into North Korea is the stories that people tell. I think we sort of accentuated our rep Song Han's story of his family being displaced from the village in North Korea. Well, this is a common story. This is not an isolation story. It's a story that happens quite a bit. And there's many stories of people during World War II or during the 1950s, during the Korean War, the amount of pain and suffering because in their families because of these wars. And now the pain just continues. There has never been resolution. There's families in South Korea who don't know if their family in North Korea is still there. And one of the things that I was struck with while being in South Korea is how the South Korean church, the Anabaptist church, is like, what's happening? Like they want information. They want to hear the stories from North Korea. They want to have those connections, but it can happen. And I feel like as MCC, we've been a way to actually connect some of that, and to bring some of that together. And I think that's really important because people are wanting information.
And I would just add, as Chris said, there's just a real yearning and for South Koreans to know what is happening in North Korea, and this sense you get of a split and divided family torn apart. And MCC is in this extremely unique position in that we are working on both sides of the border in South Korea and in North Korea. And some of the things that Blaine mentioned, even though these things may have happened decades ago, they still feel very fresh to people. And when we hear people talk about them, you can hear the pain and the yearning is still very, very strong.
Thanks, Blaine and Rebecca. You know, not very often, but sometimes when I talk to people about MCC's work in particularly North Korea, I get the sense that I'm seen as pretty naive, that MCC is seen as pretty naive. But as I listen here, this is a hope. I hear hope from all three of you, and it doesn't strike me as naive hope. It strikes me as hope that's, well, theologically grounded. It's grounded in our understanding of ourselves as a community of faith, but also some significant experience. The stories that you're telling are not whimsical stories. They're stories that are rooted in significant people-to-people relationships. And I think I come away from our hour together here tonight with an even deeper sense of a hope that is well-grounded and well-founded. Maybe one of you would be willing to have the last word here. We're going to have to close, but could you comment on what it is that gives you hope and that we could take with us as a source of hope for a place that I think, Rebecca, you started by saying, you know, there's few places on earth as divided as North and South Korea. Chris, would you be willing to give us a thought about why is it that we can hope?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer because, you know, in scripture, hope, lament and hope are always side by side. And it's, as Blaine and Rebecca just said, you know, 70 years. Growing up in Korea, I grew up there, and the country is no more united than it was when I was growing up. And so no contact, no change. Contact, change through contact, no change. There still is no contact. So, you know, we're embodying a kind of hope in the stories that we've shared tonight. We're embodying a hope of what can happen when there's contact. We've shared stories of South Koreans who are seeking peace, even though they've never met a North Korean. That's powerful. And they're living by their hope really in God, that God is a God of hope, that God wins. And we live in that sluggish in between right now. It's hard. But our hope is in God. We know that God wins. We know that peace, we know that reconciliation is God's work in Christ. And so let's hold on to these stories of where we've seen change happen. Let's hold on to the stories in other countries, East and West Germany, South Africa, where there's still serious problems, but there's been significant change, and change can happen. We've seen that. Let's pray that that would happen in our lifetime for the sake of our Korean brothers and sisters.
May it be so. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Blaine and Rebecca. This has been a really rich hour. Thank you for taking the time out of your mornings and evenings, respectively, to bring your wealth of experience and stories here. And thank you to the many participants across the globe here who've chosen to spend this hour with MCC and going deeper into this question of peace on both sides of the border. We hope you join us again. We're going to keep doing these webinars. Next month, it's about food security and climate change, looking at various farming techniques and policy approaches and advocacy. And there's also a podcast, Relief, Development, and Podcast, available wherever you listen to your podcasts. This month's episode looks at the recent earthquake in Haiti. We speak to our Global Health Coordinator, Paul Shetler-Fast, and also to MCC staff, Muriel Chaperon, about the importance of women and their response to trauma. So we are very glad that you've been with us. We invite you to join us again, and very grateful for your part in sharing God's love and compassion with all. In the name of Christ, through Mennonite Central Committee. Blessings.